Welcome to another installment of the DEMINOVA speaker series. DEMINOVA LAB is the Laboratory for Democratic Innovation and Social Movements based here at Aarhus University. And you can visit our webpage, DEMINOVA, with one M and one N for more details. Today, we're really delighted to have Thomas Olesen, who will be speaking to us on whistleblowing, activism, and democracy. Thomas Olesen is a professor at the Department of Political Science at Aarhus University. His research interests include whistleblowing, journalism, activism, and the mobilization of political symbols. He's very well known in the field of social movement studies, and his work on zapatismo, transnational activism, and global solidarity, as well as how visual injustice symbols were mobilized during the Arab Spring, have all been very influential. So it's my great pleasure to have him here today for the DEMINOVA series, and thanks very much to the people joining online as well. And I will mute now and take it away, Thomas.
Thanks for the invitation. And also thank you to you, Christina, for setting up this lab or this format. I think it's a great invention, great innovation for the university, because this is a large university, and I know lots of people who are sitting in different places who have an interest in social movements, activism, and who may be able to use this as some sort of hub for connecting their interests. So I'm really looking forward to see how that's going to progress and develop in the coming years. But yeah, thanks for the invitation to speak on something that is maybe actually on you could say on the border of political activism and social movement. So what I'm going to be focusing on is whistleblowing. And I connect whistleblowing and activism here in the title because I think these are fields that have forms of action that actually have something to say to each other and learn from each other. And just a few words maybe about my own trajectory towards whistleblowing research, because as you just mentioned, Christina, I grew up academically as a social movement scholar. I did my PhD on social movements, and the first many years after the PhD also worked on social movement related issues. And then maybe the last 5 or 6 years, I kind of changed track a little bit, focusing increasingly on whistleblowing as a phenomenon. And what struck me, and what is still actually puzzling to me, and maybe also a reason for doing this kind of talk, is how much activism research and whistleblowing research are quite separate fields. Because I was initially I got interested in whistleblowing after Edward Snowden's whistleblowing, and I was kind of expecting to find a lot on whistleblowing in political science journals and political sociology journals, but there is hardly anything on whistleblowing as a form of action in contemporary democracies. And as everyone here knows, there's a huge literature on social movements and activism. It has its own field, its own journals, and so on. So that's very well developed and has been growing steadily since the 1970s and 80s. But without interacting with whistleblowing research. And it doesn't mean that there's no whistleblowing research, it's just in all sorts of other places. So if you're looking for whistleblowing research, and that's also a very large field and thriving field, you have to look at organization journals, business ethics journals, law journals, some in psychology, some in communication. But like I said, there's hardly anything in political sociology and political science, which I find quite surprising, because whistleblowing is a political act that has a lot to say about the kind of societies that we live in. So maybe this little talk will, and I will try to use the talk also to show where are there some potential bridges between these fields. So I'll try to, now we started a little bit late, so I'll try to maybe talk for about 30 minutes. So there's also going to be time for discussion. Yes. So, how do I shift the slides here? Shouldn't I just click the arrows?
Maybe
Or do you have to?
this one or oh. What happened now?
I did it just before and it seemed to work.
Yeah, maybe this one. Oh yeah, try this one.
Yeah, I did that before. But anyway, now it works. So I'll start out by just saying a few sort of definitional things about what whistleblowing is. Then I'll say something about differences and similarities between whistleblowers, activists, and journalists. I'll say something about the way then that activism and whistleblowing interconnect in practice, and then I'll round off with some thoughts on, say, the future of whistleblowing as a phenomenon. But if we start with the definition, it's quite a long definition. It may be also a little bit awkward and unelegant, but I think it's useful in that it has sort of the main items and the main characteristics that help us distinguish whistleblowing from other kinds of action in a democracy. So it's a definition by Peter Job, and he says that whistleblowing is a deliberate, non-obligatory act of disclosure. So disclosure is the important thing here. Whistleblowing reveals something. It offers information about something. So there's a disclosure going on. It also usually gets onto public record. That means that the information that is disclosed is publicized in one way or the other. And then it's made by a person who's had privileged access to information of an organization. So privileged access here means basically that whistleblowers are employees or members of an organization. That is, they're insiders, they're part of the organization that they disclose something about. And that's what's in that term, privileged access. And then there's an organization involved. And an organization can be quite many things. It could be a private corporation. It could be a political party. It could even be a state, some kind of authority, a police department, whatever. So the organization term here is used in quite a broad way. And if you look at empirical examples of whistleblowing, we also find whistleblowing going on in all sorts of organization, ranging from the private world to states, political parties, authorities, like I mentioned. Then there has to be some kind of wrongdoing going on. So you have disclosure, but it's a specific kind of disclosure. It's about something that the whistleblower think is wrongful in some kind of way. And I think you can distinguish between stuff that is illegal, so stuff that could be punishable by the law, but it could also be things that maybe are accepted juridically, but are considered immoral or unacceptable by the larger population. For example, Edward Snowden's revelations, there was a lot of debate about whether that was actually within the law or not. But I think most people ended up agreeing that it was definitely not the right thing to do, even if it was maybe sanctioned by the laws that came into effect after 9/11. And then there's the last element is that of an external entity. So usually the disclosure is made about wrongdoing to an external entity, and that external entity could also be empirically could be many different things. It could be various forms of authorities, but very often it's the press. So I wouldn't say the large majority, but probably the majority of whistleblowers disclose what they have to disclose to the press, to journalists. So this is sort of the basics of what whistleblowing is, and I'll try to get back to that as I make these distinctions between whistleblowers and other forms of action. Just a few other comments on that, because it's quite evident that disclosure can be many things and can be done for many reasons. And there is in the literature an emphasis on whistleblowing being something that is done for so-called pro-social reasons. So for something to qualify as whistleblowing, and this is also built into to legal frameworks, for something to qualify as whistleblowing, it's important that the person who discloses information is not doing it to obtain personal gain, economical, political, whatever. It has to be done because that person thinks that information is crucial to know about for the larger public. So that's what's in the pro-social motivation. And what also helps us distinguish whistleblowers from people who leak information in order to obtain some kind of personal gain, or who do hacking also to obtain ideological or financial gains. And I've done some research on what ordinary people think about whistleblowing, and it's quite evident that people support whistleblowing, but they only support it if they can see that the person doing it is doing it for pro-social reasons, i.e. not to obtain something for him or herself. So if we look at democracies, there's actually a great deal of support for whistleblowing, but under certain conditions. Whistleblowing has to fulfill certain criteria in order to be sort of acceptable. Yeah, so let me say something about then whistleblowers and the other kind of actors that we're talking about here. Activists, of course, within this setting, but I would also include journalists in this group of actors, because I think they have a number of commonalities that are interesting, at least from a sociological and political science point of view. And as I said, the literature on whistleblowers that is out there has mainly focused on the whistleblowers per se, and quite rarely try to branch out and see or look at sort of the broader map, the broader democratic map that that whistleblowers are also part of. And I would argue that whistleblowers and activists and journalists are, they have similarities in the sense that they are all concerned with the exposure of power and a critique of power. Of course, that is not what all activists do and what all journalists do and what all whistleblowers do, but there is some kind of shared democratic ethos around monitoring, scrutinizing, exposing power, whether that's private corporations or it's states or political parties. They're part of a shared sort of democratic lineage, which is concerned with monitoring and scrutinizing people and groups in power. So whistleblowers do that, of course, when they disclose information about wrongdoing in their organizations. Activists often also do that, and investigative journalists, watchdog journalism is totally built around that idea of and see themselves and see their own identities as very much tied to that idea of keeping a tab on what people in powerful positions do and calling it out if they're doing something that is considered to be problematic. What's interesting to me is that whistleblowing, or at least the concept of whistleblowing, is a rather historical latecomer compared to activism and journalism. So, I mean, you know that there's some debate about when we can begin to speak about social movements historically. Tilly would say something around the 18th century, the French Revolution. We begin to see the emergence of forms of action that we now call social movements and protest and activism. So that has quite a deep history. And you could say the same thing about journalism. It also begins to emerge around that period. You get the first magazines, the first newspapers, and people begin to define themselves as journalists as a kind of profession. That is something specific in a democracy. But whistleblowing as a concept actually only emerges in the 1960s and 1970s. And that's not to say that whistleblowing did not exist before that time, of course, but it only gets coined and it gets its own terminology around the 1960s and 1970s. So I think that's an important point to make, because until something has a name, has a concept, it's also hard to begin to build, for example, legal frameworks to protect whistleblowing. So you have to define it and name it before that can happen. I have a paper that tries to explain a little bit why it is that whistleblowing as a concept emerges around this time, but I won't go into that. Just say that for me, it has to do with, or it emerges in the context of some radically changing notions of loyalty and obedience that are also taking place in the 60s and 70s, and also a process of individualization, which kind of, I think, liberates the employee to see his or her notions and understandings of loyalty as not being just tied to the organization, but also tied to society at large. So there are some, you could say, cultural, political transformations going on in this period that were probably necessary in order to create a kind of space where whistleblowing could emerge as a practice. But the basic point here is to say, well, whistleblowing comes pretty late in that democratic history that I was talking about before, but it's actually kind of connected to the same way of thinking about the relationship between actors outside the political system and what goes on in the political and economic systems. So that's what, so in short, what whistleblowers, activists, and journalists share. That's the very short version of it. So what are the main differences? Because there's obviously also a reason that we talk about them as different categories. And if we think back to the definition before, you can say that the main difference is probably that that whistleblowing or whistleblowers act from, you could say, an insider position. That was the privileged access part of the definition before. So they act from an insider position, whereas activists and journalists also criticize organizations, but usually do that from an outside position, from outside of the organization that is being criticized. So insider, outsider is an important distinction here. And that also means something that is found throughout the whistleblowing literature, that whistleblowers often have some kind of emotional attachment to the target of their criticism, to the organization, in a way that maybe you don't as an activist or journalist, because you're not part of that organization. So people usually entered an organization at some point because they had some positive assessment of it. Maybe they had professional aspirations and ideas that they thought could be fulfilled within that organization. They also have colleagues that hopefully they like and often have some kind of bond with. So they are attached to the target of their criticism in a different way than an activist and a journalist would be. And the literature on whistleblowing shows that quite unanimously, that almost everyone who blows the whistle don't do it because they hate their organization or want to bring it down. They often do it very reluctantly, but because they think they are obliged to do it in order to serve society or serve their fellow citizens. So that also means that the road towards whistleblowing is often a very complicated and painful one for people. It's not just something you do from one day to the next, because you have these attachments, and basically you would like the organization to correct itself. If you tell about these things that you're observing, you would want the organization to actually self-correct. So going out in public or going to an external entity with that information is usually seen as kind of last step for people when they tried everything else to make adjustments and make changes. It's not something they do with a very happy heart, so to speak. So that's quite a consistent finding in the literature. It also means that they play with different stakes than journalists and activists maybe do. And that's not to say that activists and journalists they also run often very big risks with what they do. But it's probably right to say that whistleblowers play with a set of different stakes, because once you blow the whistle, you kind of risk your job. You usually lose your job, you lose your income. You will maybe have difficulty finding a new job. The literature also shows people getting all sorts of mental issues because it's really challenging. They get family problems and so on. So they really put a lot at risk when they do what they do. And again, activists and journalists also do that, but whistleblowers do it in a different kind of way because they do it from the inside. And then they also, you could say, kind of act alone without a lot of organizational support. A journalist works on a newspaper and on a television station, has the backing of colleagues and editors, and has organizational backing that will give them moral and economical material resources to work with. Often whistleblowers act alone because they can't run around talking very loudly about what they do. So it's very often a kind of lonely process compared again to activists and journalists. And also one difference, the last one that I want to mention, is that legal frameworks to protect whistleblowers have come rather late in history. We have long had protections for activists and journalists, but legal frameworks to protect whistleblowing is a rather late thing. And of course, it only begins to emerge around the 70s and 80s when you have a conceptual terminology to talk about whistleblowing, as I mentioned before. The earliest examples are from the US, then later the UK. And it's actually only in Denmark we haven't had specific whistleblower protection until quite recently, where there was this huge EU directive that's being rolled out across member states these years, requiring all member countries to develop protective frameworks around whistleblowing. So that is something that's actually still in progress, and one major difference also between whistleblowers, activists, and journalists, that you have that legal frameworks to protect this kind of action has come at different stages in democratic history. Yeah, so then let me say something about where in practice I see whistleblowing and activism intersect, because I think that also maybe gives us some ideas about where activism and whistleblowing researchers can maybe collaborate and meet. First of all, there's a huge sort of a subset of organizations, NGOs, activist organizations, whatever you want to call them, that are actually devoted to supporting whistleblowing in some kind of way, giving legal advice, financial support, moral backing. If people consider becoming a whistleblower after they've done whistleblowing, there's a whole set of groups trying to support that kind of action. So whistleblowing has kind of generated its own subset of civil society actors that are focused on that particular kind of action. Then in a recent study that I did, looking at what happens to whistleblowers after whistleblowing, so to speak, because there's a life after that, and what that shows was based on a sort of small n sample based on whistleblower autobiographies. So it's not necessarily representative, but what that sample shows anyway is that everyone leaves their organization for obvious reasons. Either they choose to leave themselves, or they get kicked out, or they get threatened out, they get bullied out of their organization. And quite rarely people take up new jobs within the same profession. So they often leave both their organization and their profession. And many of them then actually take up a new career in activism and politics. So they don't start out as considering themselves as activists. Usually, if you ask people doing whistleblowing, they would say, I'm just an employee. I don't want to bring down the organization. I don't have a big ideological agenda. I just want my organization to do the right thing. They don't self-identify as political actors and activists, but once they go through the often very difficult and challenging process of whistleblowing, they also transform their view of things. And like I said, many of them take up new careers in some kind of activism that often has to do with the kind of issues that they were disclosing about as whistleblowers. So Edward Snowden, for example, you could say today is an activist on surveillance, the misuse of data. So there's this transformation into more activist-like careers after whistleblowing for a lot of people anyway. And I think it has to do with the fact that whistleblowing also generates a kind of symbolic capital. If you use Bourdieu's notion of symbolic capital, that because many people will kind of admire whistleblowing for being courageous because there's so much at stake. So that also gives the whistleblower some kind of credibility and visibility that they can then convert to become, for example, activists or politicians later on in their career. Yeah. So how's time?
You're fine, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's some of the intersections of activism and whistleblowing in practice. So then I just end by making some, you could say, speculative thoughts on the future of whistleblowing, because it seems that it's a form of action that's been building momentum since the 1970s. And I would even say, if we look at the last 10 years, for example, we've had quite a high number of, you could say, high-profile cases of whistleblowing. So it's definitely not something that seems to be decreasing. And I would even say that there are reasons to believe that it will be increasing in prevalence and visibility and impact over the coming years. And I think you could maybe talk about two reasons for that. First of all, like I mentioned before, there's now better protection for whistleblowing. And you could say that the better legal protection for whistleblowing, the lower the costs of engaging in this kind of practice. So you now have some kind of framework set up that can protect you if you want to go down this route, and that kind of lowers the threshold for when people will risk it. So legal frameworks, the better they get, I think that will probably motivate more people to actually do that, because it kind of lowers the risks involved in it. And you could also say legal frameworks will also help generate visibility and legitimacy. Once people hear that there's something like a legal framework, that's whistleblowing is actually a possibility, that also creates some kind of legitimacy around the action, because it's kind of sanctioned or at least protected from the state. And then finally, and that's sort of my own sociological point, I think that with the rise in digitalization as a way of organizing, as a way of producing, I think there are also reasons to believe that we'll see more whistleblowing tied to issues of digitalization. And I think there's some kind of empirical support for that, because if you look at people like Edward Snowden and the NSA surveillance issue, if you look at Christopher Wiley, who was the guy who called out Cambridge Analytica and Facebook for misusing personal data for all sorts of economical and political objectives. If you look at Frances Haugen, who's also a Facebook executive who has been very vocal on the toxic effects of algorithms used by Facebook. If you look at the Panama Papers and tax evasion, for example, which is also about how money moves across borders with just the click of a mouse, they all have something to do with digitalization in some kind of way. And I think, in a way, digitalization as a social and political phenomenon is interesting, because it's extremely complex for us to understand. It's a new kind of technology that's also very sophisticated, and sometimes working behind our backs almost. So it's hard for ordinary people like us to understand the ramification and the effects of digitalization. And therefore you often need, in order to get insight into that sometimes gray or dark world, you probably need people on the inside who know about these things from a privileged position and have specialized knowledge to talk about it, and provide information about it to people outside the organization. So I would expect that that this is a phenomenon that we're going to see more of in the coming years, and that obviously also I think it's an inspiration to see how these literatures, which are now on the separate islands, as I said, how they can actually interact. Because you could say, if you look at Snowden, Wiley, the Panama Papers, Haugen, they've all had really, really significant political effects. They matter to the world of politics. Snowden and Wiley's revelations, the Panama Papers, have led to all sorts of new legislation around GDPR and so on. So these are things that have deep political effects, and that's why it's surprising to me that it's not being more systematically treated within political science and political sociology. So with that invitation for more dialogue, I think I'll wrap it up here, and then maybe if there are some questions, we can take that.
Thank you, first of all, so much for that, because you really brought such analytical clarity to something that, I mean, I even teach about it, and I've never sat down to really break this down. So I'm going to be stealing many of your slides and breakdown there for my class here. on power politics and participation in the digital age. But it's really, really fascinating to hear about the differences and the similarities, because I always think about whistleblowing as a form of activism. But this trajectory that you're talking about is really resonates, because in fact the activism almost comes later, right? It's like the moral consciousness is awoken not through activist networks, not through consciousness raising activities, but through the actual direct witnessing of something that is ethically, morally, or legally wrong in the eyes of the whistleblower. So this schema is really useful because it helps us kind of understand differences between high-profile figures. So when I think of Snowden, of course, I think also of WikiLeaks, and I think of Assange. And so they're very different characters, obviously very different personalities, but we tend to think of them as being engaged somewhat in similar activities. But yet, under your schema, in fact, Assange is almost like a mediator. He's almost like the journalist part, even though, I mean, legally people have tried to categorize him as a journalist in order to enable him to benefit himself from the protections that supposedly we give to journalists. But because WikiLeaks also is very much seen as an activist organization, and it doesn't have that institutional backing of established legacy media, etc., they kind of fall into a gray area, right? Which is why the poor man, has been treated the way he's been treated, and so on. So what do you think about, I mean, you're talking about increasing protection for whistleblowers and that there's already legal protection for journalists. But then when we look at Assange, we see that none of that, really protects people like Assange, and look where Snowden is now, right? I mean, there are also these narratives that are mobilized against whistleblowers, especially high-profile ones working in governments or authority-related institutions of traitors. They're putting lives at risk. So there's also a huge mobilization from political elites and the media against whistleblowing. And I'm wondering, if you want to maybe say something about that in terms of maybe in the context of the increasing criminalization of protests that we're witnessing, increasing measures that are being taken in the UK and Spain and all across Europe to actually criminalize protest, critique, dissent, etc.
Also, some really interesting thoughts, and I think there are different lines in it. I'll try to sort of see if I can juggle all of them. No. But the things you mentioned are definitely connected. So if we start with Assange, I think that's quite an interesting. He's an interesting case, because when I was doing a survey on whistleblowing among the Danish population, I was also asking them just to get a sense of what if they connect the term with something out in the empirical world. And I was asking them to give examples of whistleblowing, and a lot would mention like Snowden, of course, and then some Danish cases, but also many would mention Assange, who I think is actually not technically a whistleblower in the sense, but more, like you said, a kind of mediator. And the WikiLeaks is sort of a clearinghouse where people can dump and give information that WikiLeaks then makes public. But at least under the definition that I was giving before, or in the start of the talk, Assange is more like a journalist / activist who's very supportive of whistleblowing and has done a lot to give it visibility, but is not a whistleblower himself because he's not the one with the privileged access. So then you can discuss whether he's an activist or a journalist. WikiLeaks actually defines itself as a kind of journalism, but obviously with an activist intent in a different way from say, a traditional television station or a newspaper. So it's somewhere in that borderland. And you say, I think also you mentioned it's sort of a gray zone, but it's definitely not, I think, whistleblowing. It's sympathetic to whistleblowing. It provides a space and a forum for whistleblowers, but they're not themselves whistleblowers.
But without
yeah,
them, whistleblowers don't really have anywhere to go, especially if legacy media or established media isn't interested or doesn't want to take the risk of picking it up.
So
those activist groups are actually critically important, right?
Absolutely. And you could say that something like WikiLeaks has really sort of broadened the range of possibilities of how, as a whistleblower, you can disclose your information. Because I also have numerous accounts of whistleblowers trying to get the press interested in the stories, but without much luck. So some stories actually just die because you can't sell it to the traditional media. And then how do you do it if you're just an employee? There's an interesting case of Susan Fowler, who worked for Uber, and who actually self-publicized her story about toxic work cultures in that company. So she actually didn't go through the media, but just wrote a blog post that then got tweeted, and then it was everywhere in no time, and then the media got interested. So there are different ways today of publicizing your stories where you don't have to rely on the media as maybe you did before. And then you have things like WikiLeaks and other organizations that can help you publicize your stories if you don't want to go to the press, or if for some reason the press is not interested. But if you take something like Christopher Wiley, for example, that was sort of traditional investigative journalism by The Guardian. Snowden was also very much had his stuff disclosed through The Guardian. So kind of traditional legacy media, maybe on the left, but still traditional media outlets. The Panama Papers were also very much publicized by the Süddeutsche Zeitung, for example. So traditional media still matter, I think, a lot, also to contemporary whistleblowing. But you could say, with the possibility of self-publication that I mentioned, with the presence of organizations like WikiLeaks and others, the range of possibilities of getting your stuff out there has really enlarged, and that also has to do with digitalization. So getting back to digitalization, it both provides some challenges, but also provides new opportunities. And that these wonderful stories about Daniel Ellsberg, who revealed the Pentagon Papers back in the 70s, how he spent hours and days and weeks copying on Xerox machines at night in a basement until he could get that information passed on to a journalist. And today you just plug in a USB stick, and then you have like million gigabytes of data that you can send to whoever you want. So digitalization has definitely also provided some new opportunities for getting the information out there.
I think also there's an issue of scale as well, because one of the biggest political scandals in recent history in Spain was broken by a group called 15M Barato. And they facilitated the leak by actually asking for evidence to be able to bring Rato to justice for fraud and misdemeanors and just different things. And so they set up, they're a collective that brings together journalists, hackers, lawyers, all people with different skill sets. And they set up the Xbox, which was the Buzón X, where they got this huge dump of emails and evidence revealing scandal relationship between the political elites and the banks with black credit cards that were off the books and all tied to political favors and so on. But the interesting thing there was it's kind of like what you were saying. They served as sort of this mediator, and from there, 50 different journalists from all different newspapers in Spain, established newspapers in Spain, actually went through all of those emails together, redacted, did the whole thing. But that's also connected to the legal framework in Spain, because journalists have protection of their sources under law, but the activists don't.
I see.
So they had to have accredited journalists in order to go through this material. So it's really interesting how the relationship between these different actors and the role that they need to play, and considering also this legal framework that you're referring to in the talk is so crucial.
And that just underlines, I think, the need for thinking across these disciplinary divides, because I think in general, we probably have more and more organizations that are increasingly difficult to put in simply one box.
Right.
This is activism, this is journalism, this is whistleblowing. So you have a lot of new media formats like WikiLeaks that are both journalism and activism at the same time. And you have maybe activists who also have one leg in the world of whistleblowing and so on. So these borders are becoming much more porous, also because I think there's an increasing sense of a need to collaborate across these borders to get these stories out. Sometimes you need both the activists, the whistleblowers, and the journalists to get these stories flying and create visibility around them. And what you mentioned there is kind of a fascinating division of labor, where journalists can maybe do something that activists can't, but can still help each other facilitate the visibility of these stories that need to be brought to light.
And then the story's broken by the activists, and then it gets so big that the legacy media has to cover it, or they start to really, their legitimacy will start to suffer if they completely ignore something that is already out there in a big way, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. But just getting back to one other thing that you mentioned about, yes, you have these legal frameworks, but there are also obviously some instances where that is trumped by I mean, if you can classify the act of whistleblowing as being some kind of treason and revealing state secrets, this is what got Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden in trouble. So there's a limit to how far it can protect you. And then there's also obviously, as I said, in Denmark, if you ask people in general, people would be supportive of whistleblowing, but under certain conditions.
Right.
And there's definitely also, I also found that in that material, people who are much more skeptical about it. Maybe it's okay if you reveal something about a company dumping mercury in your backyard, but maybe it's not okay to reveal something about your own state doing human rights violations, because where are your loyalties? That kind of discussions maybe come up more easily when it's about the state. And if you remember the anonymous whistleblower who talked about Donald Trump's phone call with Zelensky, where he was kind of asking him to dig up dirt on Joe Biden, that was revealed by an insider. But he also got a lot of really toxic comments for ratting or being a traitor, talking about what goes on in political backrooms. You shouldn't do that. You have loyalty to the president. You just don't do that. That kind of positions you outside of what we can accept. So he was really, I mean, he was lauded and got a lot of sympathy from some people, but other people's were really sort of vicious in terms of bringing him down. And Trump himself was saying, this is close to being a spy. That's his formulation. So of course, then that also creates this,
deflecting from the fact that you're trying to dig up dirt on your political opponents,
I
and
mean,
yeah.
so he was also creating sort of a discursive space in which you could attack this person.
Well, legitimacy is so important, isn't
Yeah.
it? Like the legitimacy that you can maintain or not maintain.
Mhm.
And that can shift, right? Because I think
Yeah.
for Assange, his relationship with Trump and his sort of hatred of Clinton and all of that
Yeah.
whole saga, I think really damaged his legitimacy in the
Yeah.
eyes of a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
sad because WikiLeaks is actually much more than Assange, but also
Yeah,
it
yeah.
became so associated
Mhm.
with one person.
Yeah.
And that's another kind of aspect of,
Yeah.
of whistleblowing, maybe
Yeah.
because it's so associated and wrapped up with the
Yeah.
actions of usually a lone person, which you
Mhm.
mentioned, that can also kind of bring some of the problems that charismatic leadership brings, right?
Mhm.
Because if anything damages the credibility of that individual,
Yeah.
then it
Yeah.
also can maybe deflect or take
Yeah.
away from the actual wrongdoing
Yeah.
that has nothing to do with them or their credibility.
No.
The wrongdoing is independent of them, if you will.
And that's why you see almost, I mean, it's almost like a button you push when people blow the whistle. The organization in question will do everything they can to dig up dirt on that person and say, well, they only did this because they're mentally unstable,
Right.
because they are actually working for another company that wants to bring us down,
Right.
or they're working for another state that wants to bring us down. They're doing this for all sorts of other reasons
Right.
than the pro-social reasons that
That they claim or
that they claim, and they probably was motivated by. So there's this whole machinery setting in motion that tries to discredit the whistleblower, and it usually goes towards motivation. So if you can say, well, they did it for money, they did it for ideology, they did it because they're crazy or hysterical, they have an axe to grind with the leadership in their organization, they're just disgruntled employees who didn't get a raise last time, that kind of
right.
that kind of stuff is used discursively to discredit the whistleblower, and that's why the whole protective framework is also so important, because then people have a place to actually go and say, well, I was treated unfairly just because I blew the whistle, and now there are possibilities to sanction organizations who do these things. But the story of retaliation is quite a consistent thing if you look at whistleblowing accounts and literatures, and it ranges from very soft retaliation to really severe retaliation. But there's almost always some kind of backfire.
But I mean, that kind of brings us to kind of even the Me Too and allegations that are brought forward of sexual harassment or other kinds of bullying, and it almost never. It doesn't really seem that even though the legislation is in place, that actually protects individuals at all, and they suffer brutal reprisals, retaliation, bullying, mental issues. So there's a lot of that that's similar to the whistleblowing, even if they're not trying to whistleblow, even if they're trying to do it without the whistleblowing element.
Yeah. And I guess you could say that about activism in general. It's always going to be a weapon that you can use against political opponents to discredit the moral character of that group or that individual. If you can do that, it's a very powerful tool that you can use to sort of deflect the criticism away from yourself. So I think this is maybe not so particular for whistleblowers, but as you say, in activism in general, and I guess in politics in general, this drive to discredit your opponent is also what goes on between Russia and Europe and the United States, Ukraine, and so on.
But I think the point you made about whistleblowers being alone and working on their own is really an important aspect, because an activist probably has a catalyst group behind them, or a network behind them, or an activist group behind them. Journalists, as you said,
Yeah.
have the whole institutional apparatus, they have legal protection and so on. But the whistleblower doesn't.
No.
And that's,
Yeah.
and I think also that is why we tend to think of them also as heroes.
Yeah.
Or traitors, if people think of them that
Yeah,
way,
exactly.
but you know, it has that,
I think that's a good point, and I think journalists and activists can also acquire that kind of sympathy and that kind of admiration, because they also do something that is often very risky to themselves. But it's maybe sometimes easier to pin those traits to whistleblowers who act alone and who really play with some very high stakes. I mean, they kind of risk
and costs.
everything to do the right thing. And
Mhm.
in general, in our society, that is something that most people can admire at some kind of level. So that's also why I said you also generate symbolic capital
Right.
as a whistleblower that allows you to speak later on and be recognized as someone important that deserves to be listened to. So every time Snowden says something, it makes it maybe not headlines, but it's something that is being paid attention to.
At least by his
anyway.
million followers or however many he has.
Yeah,
How many millions of followers does he
Yeah.
have on Twitter?
Well, that was really fascinating talk. Thank you so much, Thomas, for coming. And I hope that the people can enjoy the talk as well. Thank you so much.